What if I told you that a 20-year-old girl from the Philippines just walked into one of the most expensive tennis tournaments on the planet and accidentally broke it? Not with her racket. Not with her ranking. With 4 words she said to an umpire on live television. And those 4 words started a conversation that the sport of tennis is still not ready to have. This is the story of Alexandra Eala, Alex, and what really happened at the 2026 Miami Open. Stay with me because the ending of this story will genuinely change how you watch professional tennis. To understand March 2026, you have to go back exactly 1 year, because none of what happened this year makes sense without understanding what happened last year and why it shook an entire nation. In March 2025, Alex walked into Hard Rock Stadium as a wild card, ranked 140th in the world. No sponsorship billboards. No fanfare. No crowd. She played her early matches on Court 4 in front of literally 20 to 30 people. And I want you to picture that for a second. A stadium complex worth hundreds of millions of dollars, gleaming courts, sponsor banners everywhere, and this young Filipino girl playing in front of fewer people than you'd find at a school sports day. Nobody gave her a second thought. And then she started winning. Not just winning. She started taking apart Grand Slam champions one by one like she had a blueprint nobody else could see. Ostapenko, Madison Keys, Iga Swiatek, arguably the most dominant player in women's tennis at the time, all gone. Alex became the first Filipino player in the history of the sport to reach the semifinals of a WTA 1000 event. She eventually lost to Jessica Pegula, but by that point the tennis world was already asking, who is this girl and where did she come from? Back in the Philippines, it was something close to a national awakening. A country that had built its sporting identity around Manny Pacquiao and boxing suddenly had a new kind of hero. A young woman with a racket, a quiet ferocity, and the nerve to look the best players in the world directly in the eye. Alex herself said it best. She called that Miami run the moment everything clicked, the moment that still doesn't feel completely real to her. And here is the thing about that 2025 story that almost nobody connects to what came next. The Miami Open didn't just discover a great player that year. It discovered its own golden narrative. A real, unscripted, emotional storyline that no marketing budget can manufacture. Alex's run generated social media traffic, international news coverage, and an entirely new wave of tennis fans who had never watched a single WTA match in their lives but were suddenly glued to their screens at 2 in the morning because a Filipino girl was making history. The tournament got incredibly lucky. And then, 12 months later, it nearly threw all of that goodwill straight into the ocean. By 2026, Alex was no longer the wild card underdog. She arrived at the Miami Open as the 31st seed, ranked 29th in the world, defending serious ranking points from her semifinal run the year before. The Cinderella chapter was over. She was a contender now, and the draw put her against someone who had absolutely no interest in making life easy for her, Laura Siegemund. 38 years old, German, a veteran who had seen and done everything in professional tennis. If you don't know Siegemund's game, here's what you need to understand. She doesn't just play tennis. She controls time. Between points, she walks slowly, she breathes deeply, she turns around, she adjusts her strings, she takes her time in a way that isn't accidental and isn't random. It's deliberate. It's calculated. And it drives opponents absolutely mad because you go into a match with a rhythm in your head and Siegemund systematically dismantles that rhythm before you've even bounced the ball. The match stretched to 3 hours and 20 minutes. Alex dropped the opening set in a tiebreak after leading 3-0 and holding 4 separate set points. Gone. And then in the second set, something happened that turned a tennis match into a global conversation. Alex was serving at 2-1 in the second set, 30-15 up, when she hit a fault on her first serve. Completely routine, happens constantly in tennis. But instead of both players resetting and continuing, Siegemund walked away from the baseline, turned around, and appeared to raise something with the chair umpire. And that was the moment Alex had seen enough. She walked to the umpire's chair and said clearly, on camera, on national television, "Can you watch her time? Because she keeps delaying." I was literally about to serve and she just turned around. The umpire's response was something along the lines of, "Yes, the time is being watched, she knows, but you also need to be careful of the clock." Not exactly the decisive officiating intervention of the century. And then Siegmund, with the absolute composure of someone who has played this game for 2 decades, delivered the line that made the internet lose its mind. She looked up and said, "It's not about the time. It's about the focus." Read that again slowly because that sentence is doing a lot of work. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't apologizing. She was openly reframing deliberate time wasting as a legitimate mental strategy. And in doing so, she accidentally confessed to everything Alex was complaining about. The broadcast cameras were rolling the whole time. Tennis Channel had the statistics on screen, and here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Alex was exceeding the 25-second shot clock on 57% of her service points. Siegmund was exceeding it on 85% of hers. 85%. Nearly every single time she served, she was technically breaking the rules in plain sight at a major stadium court at a tournament that calls itself the 5th Grand Slam. And the umpire knew. The statistics knew. The broadcast audience knew. And the consequence? A quiet word. Carry on. This wasn't a one-off either. 3 years earlier at the 2023 US Open, Coco Gauff had gone through the exact same experience against Siegmund and said almost word for word what Alex said. "She's never ready when I'm serving. She went over the clock multiple times. You gave her 1 violation. How is that fair?" 3 years. 2 completely different opponents. 2 completely different tournaments. Same player. Same tactic. Same non-response from officials. That pattern is not a coincidence. That pattern is a system that has quietly decided that certain things are tolerable even when they are technically against the rules. Alex won the match, 7-6, 6-3, but the match itself had already become secondary to what it revealed. Within hours of the final point, social media was flooded. Tennis journalists started pulling up statistics. Former players started speaking on podcasts. Everyone was suddenly talking about the shot clock rule that was introduced to modernize the sport, to keep matches moving, to protect both players' and viewers' time. The rule is simple: 25 seconds between points. Exceed it, get a time violation. Except it isn't simple at all because the enforcement is entirely dependent on individual umpires making individual judgment calls in real time, and some umpires are more willing to act than others, and experienced players know exactly which boundaries they can push and by how much. Carlos Alcaraz had raised similar issues earlier in the year during a match in Qatar. The conversation was spreading across both tours. And the Miami Open, one of the wealthiest tournaments in tennis, with prize money in the tens of millions, was sitting right at the center of a story about a rule that nobody was properly enforcing. There is a specific kind of embarrassment reserved for powerful institutions that are caught failing basic accountability tests in public. The tournament had built its entire identity around prestige, around being elite, around being the event Butch Buchholz originally dreamed of calling the Winter Wimbledon. Prestige requires consistency. It requires rules that apply equally to everyone, the 20-year-old rising star and the 38-year-old veteran alike. And what the world had just watched, with the statistics literally on the broadcast graphics, was proof that the consistency wasn't there. The irony is almost too sharp. The Miami Open had accidentally made Alex its most marketable story in 2025. And in 2026, she walked back into the same tournament and held up a mirror to it. Alex moved on. She beat Magda Linette in the 3rd round convincingly and was playing some of the best tennis of her career. But the conversation she had started kept growing without her. Fans were asking the question that tournament directors genuinely dread hearing in public. Why does this keep happening, and why does nothing change? Because what everyone now understood was that this wasn't about one bad umpire or one difficult opponent. It was about a structural gap in how the rules are written, how they are enforced, and who benefits from that gap. And then came the 4th round against Karolina Muchova. And this is where the story stops being about controversy and becomes something rawer and more honest. Muchova dismantled Alex 6-2, 6-2 in 1 hour. 20 winners, barely any errors, clinical from start to finish. The opening set lasted 22 minutes. It was not close. And almost immediately after the match, analyst Brad Gilbert publicly pointed out that Alex needed to dramatically improve her first serve percentage after winning only 36% of her first serve points. The timing was noted by a lot of people who follow these things closely, because there is always a section of the audience, in sport, in life, that is waiting for the person who spoke up to fail. Waiting to use that failure as evidence that the complaint was the problem, not the system. It is one of the oldest silencing techniques there is. You don't argue with the criticism, you just wait for the critic to stumble and then point. But here is the thing about Alex. She did not stumble in the way people expected. She lost. Yes, she dropped 16 places in the rankings to 45th and gave back 270 points. The ranking system delivered the kind of swift, measurable consequence that the officiating system had refused to deliver to Siegmund. The irony of that is almost too much. But then Alex sat down in front of the press and said something that nobody saw coming. She was calm. She was clear. She said that after a great win, she's not all that good, and after a bad loss, she's not all that bad. She said you have to look at everything objectively once the emotions settle. That is not what someone broken by pressure sounds like. That is what someone who has quietly built a philosophy that most athletes twice her age are still searching for sounds like. And then she went to social media, where the tennis discourse was still burning, and instead of pouring fuel on it, she wrote that Miami is still the best, that she'll always have a special place in her heart for the tournament, and that she had just completed her first Sunshine Double, both Indian Wells and Miami in the same season. A milestone. Completed in the middle of a controversy, a ranking drop, and a brutal fourth-round exit. She claimed ownership of her story in one post without a single angry word. But her grace doesn't close the question she opened. It just makes it harder to ignore. Because the 2026 Miami Open exposed something that wasn't new but had never been this visible. The WTA's enforcement system for the shot clock is inconsistent, umpire-dependent, and easily manipulated by players experienced enough to know exactly where the line sits and how far past it they can go without genuine consequence. The technology to fix this exists right now. Automatic enforcement exists. Hard penalties exist. Tennis Channel was broadcasting the violations in real time to millions of viewers while the umpire on court was essentially letting them accumulate. The gap is not technological. The gap is political. It is about whether the organizations that run this sport have the will to enforce their own rules even when the player breaking them is experienced, established, and has been breaking them for years. On the Served podcast with Andy Roddick, Alex reflected on everything. The rise, the influence, the weight of being a symbol for an entire country. She said she's still the same person she was in 2025, that the success has grown but she hasn't changed inside. She is grateful for what tennis has given her and she carries that genuinely. But gratitude from a player does not remove the responsibility from the institutions around her. What she started on that Miami Stadium court, a young woman from a country that had never produced a top 50 tennis player standing up in front of the cameras and saying this isn't fair, that conversation is not finished. The real question now is whether the people who run professional tennis are willing to have it seriously before the next Alex, whoever she is, wherever she comes from, has to stand up and say it all over again. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Should the WTA go fully automatic on shot clock enforcement, no umpire discretion, zero exceptions? Or is human judgment the thing that actually separates tennis from every other sport? I want to know where you stand. And if this story hit different, if you believe women's tennis deserves better than this, subscribe right now because this channel covers it the way it actually deserves. With facts, with honesty, and without flinching.